Dear guests, dear friends, dear all, we have to start. We are about to start because it's also is a broadcast on different kind of channels. And today I have the honor. My name is Rasa Juknevičienė. I am member of European Parliament from Lithuania. And today I have the honor to introduce the participants of a very important discussion. It looks like it's interesting for you as well. It's not very often we have in our audiences so many people from outside of the Parliament. So we politicians tend to talk. It's our business to talk. But today I want more to listen than to talk. So in the backdrop of the terrible war, the topic of Russian culture causes fierce debates that range from passionate calls to abandon all Russian authors to equally strong belief that there is no need to change anything. Recently, I was in Moldova. Next to my hotel, there was the Pushkin street. In the past, I would not have even noticed it, because in the USSR, every city, even small cities, had to have a Pushkin street. Now I can't help but think, why in Chisinau? And why not in the name of Byron or Adam Mickiewicz? Because it is a legacy of the Soviet era. This event is also important for the future of Russia. Why? Because I believe that Russia will become a normal state in my lifetime. But there is a long way to go. One of the most important tasks for Russia itself is to abandon its imperialistic past and never come back to it. That's what this discussion is about. But let's move on to the guests. And also, before that, a word to Ambassador Arnoldas Pranckevičius, Lithuanian ambassador to EU. This embassy was also among organizers, important organizers of that event. Ambassador, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Juknevičienė, and welcome to everyone here. Indeed, as a permanent representation of Lithuania to the European Union, we are very happy to be partners of this very interesting debate, which we believe will be provocative, insightful, intriguing, but indeed extremely important. Now, as we already passed 1 year mark of this brutal Russia's war against Ukraine, as we here in the city mobilize all of our efforts, on the one hand to help Ukraine with our continuing military support, financial support, as well as support in terms of achieving and reaching accountability and long-term justice, long-term reconstruction, and yes, long-term vision of Ukraine as EU member state, but at the same time keeping our pressure and keeping our unresolved action against Russian regime through our 10 sanctions packages and many other measures that are being in place. And in this whole context of European policymaking and all the tools that we employ day and night here in the city, it's very important to discuss also the role of culture in this war, as well as think for a minute about the origins of Russian imperialism, perhaps where did it go wrong, where did we as the West got it wrong, and what to make sure, what we can do also collectively, as Rasa has said very, very rightly, that in the future, one day, we might still have Russia as a country that can indeed embrace democracy, civilization, human dignity, and all the principles that are dear to us. So without spoiling more of the time, very much looking forward to this discussion. Very happy that Edward Lukasa and Kristіна Сабаляускайте are here with us today, and I wish you a very, very interesting evening.
we will move to audience to listen you from that side. And Edward Lucas, you will start, I think, as we agreed.
Good. Well, good evening. So our first reference point here, I think, is this enormous territorial imperial state built on these claims of a civilizing mission, but in reality, an entity which gained its lands by a mixture of military conquest, looting, and other techniques in the imperialist toolbox, a huge territorial reach that was retained and bolstered partly by violence, but also by linguistic and economic and cultural hegemony. Another central element, the fetishization of World War II, both the resistance to the Nazis at the start of the war and the sort of finest hour idea of that, and then the enormous focus on the cult of victory afterwards. Serious geopolitical setbacks brought out of economic weakness, continuing questions about the sort of core internal empire, even after losses from the external empire, whereas of fragmentation, rather nervous relations with the United States and its claims to primacy, and a love-hate relationship with Europe and the European identity, a sort of mixture of superiority and inferiority and a dose of paranoia. Huge epistemic privilege coming from the fact that the national language is also a world language, a cultural superpower, sometimes resting on its laurels a bit, but with museums stuffed with stolen property, superficially imposing, but ultimately perhaps rather fragile edifice, now facing very difficult questions about the colonial and imperial past. But anyway, enough about my own country. We're not here to talk about Britain. We're here to talk about Russia. And I make this point because I come from a country which is in the throes of a kind of cultural war about the colonial and imperial past. Every university is looking about questions of decolonizing the curriculum. We are discussing whether to hand back some of the centerpieces of our big national museum back to countries which we obtained / looted them from in the past. And I don't make any particular judgment about the British debate. I just note that it's going on. And in Russia, it hasn't started. And every one of those elements that I mentioned about Britain and its empire and the potential fragmentation of Britain, our relationship with Ireland and with Scotland and so on, every one of those questions is, or at least should be, a live, burning question for Russia. So let's try and kickstart that debate now. I think there's now a kind of consensus, very belated consensus in the West, that Russia is fundamentally an imperial country. This comes as no surprise to people from the Baltic states and from Poland, because you were warning the West about this right back in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, those warnings were ignored and the people who delivered them were patronized and belittled. But it was already clear back in the 1990s with the fetishization of World War II, the First Chechen War, the Karaganov Doctrine and many other things, that although the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had lost its monopoly and the planned economy had ended in failure, the basic imperial idea, which long predates the Soviet Union, of course, was the Tsarist imperial idea, but had a Soviet manifestation, and then after 1991, it continued. And we're dealing with the consequences now. So we've kind of got belatedly the idea that we are dealing with an imperial power, but we have not yet focused our attention on the fact that there is a culture behind that imperial power, going back not just decades, but centuries. And that's what we're here to discuss. If we're going to look forward to a de-imperialized Russia, that will also mean the de-imperialization of Russian culture. What does that mean? Well, we need to look at the way in which Putin and the Kremlin weaponize or instrumentalize Russian culture, and also how it distorts our view of Russia and of countries round about Russia. I don't only blame the Kremlin for this. We are quite capable of misunderstanding Russian culture on our own without any help from the Putin regime. We need to look at the Russocentrism that it engenders, the idea that Russian culture is what matters, Russia's a superpower, around about it are some other countries who do their stuff, but that's not really important. We need to look at the way in which the cultural assets of Russia legitimize other things, implicitly delegitimizing those other cultures and countries round about. Also, perhaps the idea that Russia is on some kind of superior plane. Russia does things in a deeply spiritual and deeply important and deeply historically rooted way. It's the heir to Byzantium, and you are, in the West, you are the heirs to the Crusaders who sacked Byzantium. So please know your place in the rotten West. I want to just emphasize very firmly, this is not talking, we are not advocating a cancel culture towards any Russian artist, any Russian book, any Russian piece of music, any Russian artwork. We are talking about the need to discuss these cultural artifacts and to look at them in different ways, but no one here is saying burn them or put them in the archives and never look at them again. I could not have a better colleague on the platform than Kristýna, who is a real expert. I'm just a journalist and think tanker, but Kristýna is I would say, perhaps the foremost Lithuanian cultural critic. Her book, Silva Rerum, is perhaps one could say, the Jahrhundertroman of Lithuania. It's a fantastic historical novel. Please do buy a copy and read it. If you read one of, is it 14 languages it's been translated in?
I believe 12. But I think my more important novel is the last one, the recent one, Peter's Empress.
I was just getting on to Peter's Empress, but thank you for stealing my...
This is the crucial one.
Stealing my punchlines is fine. Kristýna is Lithuania doesn't have any aircraft carriers, but it has a cultural aircraft carrier. And Kristýna, I'm very proud that you've just been... You have an amazing ability to project power field, and it's an honour to share residency of London with you, although you've also just been made a honorary citizen of the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. So my job really, I know the questions, I don't, or some of them at least, I don't really know the answers, but you do. So I'm going to be guiding the discussion for about the next 45 or 50 minutes, and then we will turn over to the audience, and please get ready to ask questions. And we've both agreed that difficult questions are much more interesting than friendly ones. So if you just want to say that we're absolutely right, save that till the end. If you want to say we're wrong, that would be much better. And welcome also all the people who are watching this over the internet. Kristýna, where do we start with this?
I don't know. I started personally researching the material, the historical archives for my latest novel, Peter's Empress, which is about the Lithuanian wife of Peter I and the Peter's epoch. And I was trying to understand the Russian culture, why it is so different, so peculiar, and why it is so often quite misunderstood in the West and in the Europe. And as Edward said, no one is going to argue that we should cancel something or censor. My aim was and is always to understand, and to understand it by referring to the primary historical sources from the texts, from the epoch, and trying to understand what is so different and so peculiar about the Russian culture. So we were already talking about the centuries, about time, and I realized that for the past 100 years, throughout the 20th century, Russia almost had no contact with Europe and the West because of the Iron Curtain, of the closed borders, of the right to travel freely, which was taken from its citizens. So it basically was a closed state. Then I went further back and I started thinking about past 1,000 years. And it's interesting because at the beginning of that 1,000 years, Russia is anything but empire. It was under the Tatar-Mongol yoke from 1230. And again, it was quite closed off from Europe and from the West. And the situation only changes in the 1700 with Peter the First. And the 18th century is the massive Europeization, the willful Europeization of the Russian culture. But how did it look at the beginning of the 18th century? It's very interesting that if we do the maths, so throughout that 1,000 years, Russia was isolated from the West for about 544 years. That's an interesting thing. Before Peter the First started modernizing and westernizing Russia, it was a very interesting country. It had no universities or higher education. And one university was founded at the end of the 18th century. It was founded as a tool of state, not an autonomous academic self-governing body in the manner of the Western universities, which developed from the convents as the independent royally founded research centers. When the first Russian university was founded at the end of the 18th century, it was a tool of state. It was designed to produce this science for the needs of the state. And this continues up to this day, and all the humanities remain heavily indoctrinated by state propaganda. Russia, before 1700, had no contact or experience of Renaissance or Reformation ideas. That's very important. It did not participate in early modern European maritime expeditions or discoveries, or didn't share any scientific discoveries with the rest of the Europe. There was no municipal governance tradition. Russian cities are cities without the town halls. And the attempt to introduce a nobility self-governance in provincial towns and zemstvo, it was an initiative without much success, and it started only in 1866. Another important thing that Russia had no semi-autonomous courts of princes or church dignitaries with their sponsorship of arts and sciences, which was typical for the rest of Europe, and it was sort of, a balance with the absolutism of the sovereign. It had no secular art, music, or literature before 1700. It had no tradition of knighthood, no courtesy, no code of honor of the knights, which again is one of the crucial features of the European culture from medieval times. Historically, no burghers, no middle class. Even in the 19th century, everyone of some substance belonged to the table of ranks, and the social strata was managed by the autocrat. It had no nobility in the European sense, as the independent class of hereditary landowners that could provide a regulatory balance to the absolute power. It was a patriarchal state with Tsar, where any noble was a slave, a rab to a Tsar. And basically, the land could be taken from that noble anytime if he was disobedient to the ruler. So very briefly, that's Russia before Peter I. And suddenly it develops and it does its cultural homework throughout the 18th century. And at the cusp of the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, the Russians start traveling, convinced that they have done their cultural homework. They start traveling to Europe. And they feel very, very alien there because they feel that they are not being accepted. They are not being admired for their efforts. Von Wiesen, let's say, Karamzin, others, they felt deeply offended that Europe does not accept them as, equals culturally. And then they get offended. And then the sour grapes syndrome starts in Russian culture. And this is the pivotal, this is the crucial moment.
So this is a very good jumping off point, this combination of a sort of superiority complex and an inferiority complex towards Western culture. And I wonder, we mentioned Pushkin in the introduction to the, in the title of this, Pushkin. And Pushkin, obviously, as Rasa said, is absolutely central. The giving busts of Pushkin is one of the things that Russian embassies like to do around the world. Some people here will know this story very well, but others won't. So let's talk a little bit about what happened with Pushkin and the Decembrists and the great Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian poet Adam Mickiewicz, Mickiewicz in Lithuanian, and their great literary row after the rebellion against the Tsar.
I think that the interesting thing with the Pushkin, that when Pushkin starts creating and writing poetry, the poetry is perceived as, trivial thing. It's not serious. Serious men did not write poetry at that time. Poetry was the entertainment of St. Petersburg salons. It was mostly read by women. It was mostly directed by women to divert them while their husbands were doing politics, and all the literary historians can, affirm what I'm saying, that, Pushkin was one of the first who became really popular and who did great job reinventing and polishing the Russian language. At the same time, in that milieu, in the milieu of the salons in St. Petersburg, was also the refugee from partitioned Poland, Lithuania, Adam Mickiewicz, who was very charismatic. And he was, in a way, if we read the contemporaries, for example, Marquis Astolphe de Custine and his letters from Russia, where he compares Pushkin and Mickiewicz. So the Frenchman, he's positively sure that Mickiewicz is a poet of higher quality. He's much more profound, masterful. And indeed, if we read the Pushkin's letters and correspondence and his and even his poetry, because he sort of involved himself in a certain poetic correspondence with Mickiewicz. So at that time, Pushkin, in a way, looked up at Adam Mickiewicz.
Right. And then we get the revolt against Tsarism and this kind of war of poems. So talk us through what happened.
Orlando Figes is convinced that Pushkin played part in betraying Decembrists. I'm not that good expert on this particular moment in history, but if we trust Orlando Figes, so he said that sort of Pushkin seeped some information to the Tsarist administration.
And then Mickiewicz writes his famous poem, Forefathers, Dziady, in Polish, and Pushkin, which just talk us through how, because I think for people who don't know that this is a sort of very good example of a sort of culture war. how it happens.
So Mickiewicz writes Dziady, which in translation is the eve of the forefathers, and in the final chapters he writes very passionate, very gentle, and very, rhetorically asking verse, saying, addressed to my friends Moscowitz, до моїх приятелів Москалі, and he asks, what happened to you? What happened to this great nation? Why did you become the imperialistic way you are now? What happened to the Decembrists who were exiled to Siberia? What happened to all those great liberal minds whom I admired? And then there's a retort from Pushkin.
Yes.
And then there's a retort from Pushkin, a quite nasty one, saying that
I've got it here in English. It says,
yes.
Why rave ye, babblers, ye lords of popular wonder? Why such anathemas against Russia do you thunder? What moves your idle rage? Is it Poland's fallen pride? 'Tis but Slavonic kin among themselves contending, an ancient household strife, oft judged but still unending. This is some English, slightly imaginative English translation, but and it sounds the sort of thing that you could have a Putinist poet writing about Ukraine right now.
No, but I think another important thing that you read the English translation, and we're facing the translation problem, because I here have the Klevetnikom России, the
Yes.
original in Russian. It's much more harsh.
Okay, well,
It's more Soloviev sounding, and I think that edge and that aggression is quite lost in the English translation, and there's probably about 40 or 50% of it remaining. So the Brits did the job, to round up the angles, because it's.
Yes. I'm sorry, just hands up everyone here who understands Russian. Okay, it's definitely worth you reading it in Russian.
А чем шумите вы, народные витии? Зачем анафемой грозите вы России? Что возмутило вас? Волнение Литвы? Оставьте. Это спор славян между собою. Домашний старый спор, уж взвешенный судьбою, вопрос которого не разрешите вы.
A bit from the end as well.
Вы грозны на словах, попробуйте на деле. Иль старый богатырь, покойный на постели, не в силах завинить своих измаильских штых, или русского царя уже бессильно слово, или вам с Европой спорить ново, или русских от побед отвык, или мало нас, или от Перми до Тавриды, от финских хладных скал до пламенной Колхиды, от потрясенного Кремля до стен неподвижного Китая, стальной щетиною сверкая, не встанет русская земля. Так высылайте ж к нам, витии, своих озлобленных сынов. Есть место им в полях России среди чуждых им гробов. So the resume is quite imperialistic. We'll be there from China, to Poland and Lithuania, and if you don't like it, come to us, and you will lay, in tombs in our fields. Pushkin has wrote another poem directed directly at Adam Mickiewicz, much shorter one, where he accuses him of being one of them. And how he left for the West, and he has in mind Mickiewicz emigration to Paris, and how the Russians bid him farewell, and now he became one of them, of the hated Westerners, and how he betrayed his former friends, the Russians, and now is critical of Russians. So first of all, it should be emphasized that Adam Mickiewicz couldn't betray Russians by becoming one of them, of the Westerners, because naturally he was a Westerner since the day he was born. And secondly, I would like to quote again Astolphe de Coustin, who wrote that, "I am struck by the Russian excessive concern with the manner in which they are judged by outsiders. They are continually preoccupied with the impression their country is making on the traveler." And more importantly, another quote, "Any disapproval they treat as treachery, any unwelcome truth as a lie." So basically, even minor disagreement, I mean, Mickiewicz's poem is very mild in tone. It's full of concern. It's not antagonizing, but it was perceived by Pushkin as betrayal, as a treachery. Because how could you not love such a great country, great land, which lays from China to the Baltic?
So from that springboard, we then go on through the whole of the 19th century, right up to the Russian Revolution. And is there anything else from that era? I'm quite interested in Tolstoy and his novel about the Caucasus, Haji Murat, which both sort of romanticizes but also others and exoticizes the Chechens. I'm very struck by the fact the Circassian genocide barely seems to feature at all. This is one of the most striking imperial episodes in Russian history and seems to have passed Russian literature rather passed it by. But before we get on to the Soviet era, is there any other thing you want to highlight?
I want to highlight from the 19th century that basically that this feeling of being excluded from the European cultural discourse at the beginning of the 19th century. I think that very important moment was the war, the Napoleonic War, the War of 1812, because the Russian people, they felt that, like they were doing their best to integrate with the European culture, primarily, of course, through the French language and the French customs, because that was the vogue of time. And suddenly they are at war with this admired culture. And this was a very serious issue for the Decembrists, the war. And it was never the same afterwards, I believe. They realized that they're not being accepted, that they're, and indeed they were, that they are slightly inferior culturally, and then they are starting from that sour grape syndrome, inventing theories about the Russian superiority. It's enough to read the von Wiesen's or Karamzin's texts after their travels to the West, saying that the West is rotten, the West is treacherous, the West is very insincere, the West is completely spoiled, the customs are horrible, and we Russians were very spiritual, and we will teach the world what is, the Enlightenment, what is Christianity, what is things. The first person to criticize this was Chadaev. He also became the first case of punishing psychiatry, because he was declared a madman after his famous letter where he highlighted this antagonism that Russia is by no means can speak from this superior position, because they still need to develop more to be part of the European cultural discourse.
I'd like to spend a few minutes looking at the idea of irrationality. As someone who's spent a lot of my time trying to explain to Western policymakers how to deal with the late Soviet Union and then what followed it, I think the two most irritating phrases that I used to get was one, Churchill's quote that Russia is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a riddle, or whatever. I've got that the wrong way around. And also that ghastly phrase that Russia can't be understood with the mind. A third one.
That's Tuchev.
That's
yeah.
Tuchev. And perhaps a third one, which I think goes into my personal scrapbook of really, really stupid remarks by Western leaders who said, you've got to realize you're dealing with a country populated by characters from Dostoevsky. And this sort of extreme exoticization that Russia is you're either dealing with Raskolnikov or himself, or a country full of people like him, so therefore normal rules don't apply. Of course, it's tremendously useful for Russian policymakers, and it gives the basis for this whole idea that we've seen ever since 1991 of do what we want, otherwise we'll go crazy. And then sort of like the Incredible Hulk, don't make Hulk angry, you won't like me when I'm angry. It's a bit of a stretch from Marvel Comics through to Dostoevsky, but I think you see what I mean. How should we deal with this sort of instrumentalized irrationality?
After, reading a huge amount of historical literary texts, cultural texts, studies on Russian culture, I call this irrationality a bipolar syndrome. But it reminds me of bipolar syndrome because that very same person, let's say Dostoevsky, or let's say the philosopher Ivan Ilyin, he can be very critical, describing Russia. For example, that's Pushkin's words. A nation which is indifferent to any duty, to any justice, to any truth. A nation which does not recognize any human dignity, which absolutely does not recognize neither a free man nor a free thought. That's Pushkin's words about Russia. Ivan Ilyin, beginning of the 20th century philosopher who has a huge impact on Dugin, on Putin, he wrote about Russia. Russia is the vilest, the most nauseatingly despicable country in the whole history of the world. By the way of selection, there was produced the most horrible breed of moral freaks, for whom the understanding of the good and the evil is turned inside out. Throughout its whole history, this nation is drowning in shit, and at the same time wants to drown in it the whole world. And then he turns back, and he invents this quasi-religious theory about Russia's superiority and mission of reviving Christianity and ideals in the whole world. Same Dostoevsky. He can write how a Russian peasant beats his wife in the most brutal way, how he sort of, squeezes her legs into the hole between the two floorboards and, beats the life out of her. And then, after 5 minutes, he could write about the purity of the Russian soul and its closeness to God, and that only the Russian peasant is, the true child of God and the incarnation of the Christian values. And it's all the same person. So when we have, sometimes the glance and the side directed inwardly towards the Russia, we have this, completely destructive contempt, even, some masochistic hatred for one's own country. But when they're keeping the facade towards the West or facing the world, then we see the complete bravura and, the conviction of one's superiority and being, so much better than the rest of other nations. So for me, that's a bipolar thing, I would call it.
Yes. Well, I'm glad we're touching on this uniqueness. I've got two quotes here. And I think some people in the audience will get both of them, but some of you won't. So you have to guess, who am I quoting here? So the first one goes, to love as the Russian soul loves is to love not with the mind or with anything else, with all that God has given, all that's within you. No one else is capable of such love. And here's the second one. So what are our particular traits? It seems to me that the Russian person thinks mainly about the highest moral truths. Western values are different, focused on oneself. Personal success is the measure of success in life, and the more successful a man, the better he is. But this is not enough for us Russians. We are less pragmatic, less calculating than other peoples. We have bigger hearts. Perhaps this reflects the grandeur of our country, its boundless expanses, but our people have a more generous spirit. So, anyone guess who the first one is? It's Gogol. It's a quote from Taras Bulba that Soviet school children used to have to memorize by heart. And the second one, of course, is Vladimirovich Putin speaking in 2014. But I think that neatly exemplifies this kind of extraordinary... And what's so odd about this is I can't imagine any politician from any other country saying that. I mean, yeah, Americans believe in manifest destiny and believe it's the greatest country in the world. But if you just take the word Russian out of that and try to put in German or French or British or American or really any other country, maybe Chinese, I don't know. But the idea, it seems to me that the Belgian person believes mainly about the highest moral truths. It sounds absurd. How could you say that with a straight face? Yeah, there's Putin saying it in his speech to the Federal Assembly. Am I right that this uniqueness is unique? This sense of uniqueness is actually unique?
I think it's actually, yes, unique. And probably the explanation, again, I will quote Astolphe de Costin and his text.
Costin is, as we call him in English, is absolutely worth reading again and again and again.
Letters from Russia, 1839. You can say of the Russians, both great and small, that they're intoxicated with slavery. It is a country where brutality is mere routine, death closer than parent or friend. So when you live in an environment which is operated and which spiritus movens is violence and brutality, so you need some consolation. And I think that this invented consolation is the myth about,
so it's to make up for the weather.
I think, yes, absolutely.
Right, we're going to hit the fast forward button because I want to get on to questions. I know there's an enormous amount of expertise in the audience. It'd be good to hear from it. But let's fast forward to the revolution and what the sort of Sovietization of Russian culture, which to me is an enormous dead end or wrong turning, and the whole Silver Age, which to me was the most admirable part of Russian culture in both art and music and literature, comes crashing down, and one left with the rather thin bit of Maxim Gorky and a few other things, but basically full on socialist realism in art and literature and everything else. How does the Soviet Union and the Soviet authorities, how do they use Russian culture?
Oh my God, that's a very painful moment, because, you know, when you follow Russian cultural history throughout the ages, the beginning of the 20th century, it's the super important moment when you watch and you think, finally, they're going to make it, finally, and you are full of admiration of, you know, Bunin, Silver Age poets, the abstract artists, because art, the visual art, was very much lagging behind the whole time of the European trends. And then finally, at the beginning of the 20th century, you see, you know, something really unique and in tune with the time being born. And then, bam, the revolution. And the art becomes the tool for propaganda. Firstly, I think through cinema, because it's very accessible for the illiterate masses, and we should remember that Russia in the time of the revolution was largely illiterate. So what Sergei Eisenstein did with his films, I belong to the generation who was being shown in my childhood years his film October, the October, and we sort of believed that this is the actual documentary of the October Revolution, which wasn't true. It was just filmed soon afterwards, and there's this famous anecdote from the State Hermitage that when they filmed the storming of the Winter Palace, afterwards, after the cut and the scene was cut, an old guard, he was sort of, wiping the shards of Sèvres porcelain vases from the floor, and bitterly saying, the first time round your lot was more careful. So yes, so it was all became a tool to convey the propaganda of the new order, and it had to be very simplified. It had to be accessible to the masses, and hence, both simplified and controlled by the state.
But there was a paradox which, on the one hand, the Soviet Union defined itself as being overturning the corrupt, feudal, theocratic, backward old order, and yet it also legitimized itself by saying we are the cultural heirs of the great 19th century, Russia's 19th century cultural greats.
Because I think it was already a trademark in Europe. Music, great composers, the exiles in Paris and France, such as Le Ballet Russe, Diaghilev, but then again, it beggars a question whether Diaghilev and Le Ballet Russe would have been so successful if they stayed in Russia. Maybe they became, so avant-garde just because they left Russia and they could flourish in more friendly and in more experimental environment. Same with a lot of composers, same with Stravinsky, same with some writers who were made to leave the country. But of course, later the government and the propaganda, all this symbolic capital was very handy to use to further Soviet.
And during the Cold War, which I think I and some people in this room still remember, that idea that the Soviet Union is the country of, it's the Bolshoi Ballet and the Hermitage, was a tremendous sort of cultural battering ram. It legitimized the whole ghastly Soviet system, because how could you really regard the Soviet regime as illegitimate when it had such an enormous stake in world civilization. I'm going to fast forward again, and I realize this is an absolutely kind of, we are hurtling through the decades and centuries, and there's a great deal we haven't touched on. But we kicked off with Pushkin at the beginning, and I want to finish with Brodsky, because I'm sure there are many people in this room who absolutely revere Brodsky. For me, his dialogue with his prosecutors at his trial in Leningrad, where they said, "Who gave you the authority to be a poet?" This was one of the sort of iconic, to misuse that word, moments of the Cold War. And so it's really painful to read Brodsky's poem about the independence of Ukraine, which is, almost as nasty as Pushkin's poem about
I would
Poland.
say nastier.
No, although I think we were saying on the Eurostar on the Wave, it's actually a better poem.
It's a masterful poem. It's a masterful work of poetry. And with Brodsky, I admired Brodsky myself. I used quotes of his noble speech, of his verses in some texts in my speeches. And this particular poem for decades was mostly laying dormant somewhere, and it just surfaced with the war in Ukraine. And I was lucky to be able to speak to people who knew Brodsky personally and who were his close friends, notably one famous Lithuanian poet, Tomas Venclova. And he told me that Brodsky wrote this poem quite passionately. And he was, bubbling with desire to share it. And his friend advised him against it. So it was never published. It was just read publicly 2 times. One time it was recorded on film. And that's how it came for posterity. But it's really nasty poem, and in its tone, it reminds me, of the situation when a husband abuses and rapes his wife, and then suddenly his wife escapes from him, and he slanders.
Yes,
the wife.
It's such an unpleasant poem that for many people couldn't believe that Brodsky had actually written it, and some people, it was only, I think, in 2015, it's on YouTube now, actually, perhaps the first performance, and to his credit, Brodsky never published it, so it's not in any of his works. So I don't know, do you want to just read a little bit here? I've got it here, or maybe you've got it on the...
English or Russian version?
And enough people understand Russian that you should read it in Russian. Those who don't can just Google it, and it's there in English as well.
No.
No?
I can't read it.
It's too bad. It's too bad.
I can't read it. I respect Ukrainians too much.
Yes.
I don't want...
Well, that's yes. You can. This is your homework after the lecture: is to go back and read it. And if you don't know Russian already, this is a good opportunity to learn it. So I think we will. I was going to touch on Bulgakov, talking of Ukraine, because that's another very painful, difficult question. And our mutual friend Oksana has written about the White Guard and how the sort of anti-Ukrainian themes, again in a canon of literature that for many people epitomises everything they most like about Russia. But I think we'll leave Bulgakov perhaps to the questions. Yeah. We're almost at 7 now. So I'm expecting a forest of hands. I know quite a lot of people in this room, but I don't know everybody. So if when you stick your hand up, you could just introduce yourself briefly before asking your question. I don't know whether we have, I think that we don't have roving microphones, but you can just make your microphone work in front of you, pretend that you're, for a moment, that you're a member of the European Parliament. Although, in fact, some of you are members of the European Parliament, so no pretense involved. But let's see some hands. Yes, gentleman there in the green shirt. Yes, good. Yes, it's working.
You can. Well, I'll try to be a devil's advocate. Well, not Putin's. But, well, okay, I'm Robert Spogorelis. I work for the Parliament. I'm not a member. I work for the administration, with visitor service. But I just wonder, I mean, in terms of organizing this debate, did you consider having a native Russian speaker next to you? I mean, because it's going to, if someone, from Poland, from England, would be discussing Lithuanian culture, I know the context is different, it's the political the war and so on, but I mean, still, it's, for the sake of objectivity, I would prefer to have someone, not Putinist, but someone from emigre writers or historians next to you. Because it's kind of, we're discussing something else which is not ours. Of course, the culture doesn't belong just to the Russians. I understand it's broader, but still, it's a provocation maybe, but well, what do you think?
Neither of us are the organisers. I don't know if they want to answer, but I mean, I would say that I think it's, if you imagined a discussion about English colonialism in English literature, I can absolutely imagine you might have an African and an Indian writer discussing this, and I think if the Russians argue, as they do, that Russian is a world language, that means we all have a stake in what's said in Russian, and we've already seen. So I asked earlier, hands up, everyone in the room who speaks Russian. Can we just see? No, we don't need to do it again. But I just want hands up, everyone in the room who speaks Russian, but is not a sort of quote ethnic Russian, as in someone that Putin would actually go to war to protect. Yes, so it's a very large number of people. Christine, do you want to say anything on this question? Why is there not a Russian?
I think it's very typical of our times, and it's a little bit in vogue with the whole, political correctness and cancel culture, and as asking whether a white person has the right to write fiction, a novel about black person. I don't know. Why not? I don't mind a Brit and a Frenchman discussing the Lithuanian culture, and I don't think they need to be necessarily included as some sort of anchor or something. We live still in a liberal world.
I think the idea of a Briton and a Frenchman discussing Lithuanian culture is a fairly rare prospect. Although I look forward to the days when I shall meet my French counterpart. Let's have some more questions.
It's not that far away, I believe.
There was a lady at the back who had her hand up. There's the lady there in the pink. Yes, go ahead. Long black hair. Go ahead.
Yep. Thank you so much for giving me the floor, and thank you so much for this discussion. I just wanted to add, because I'm a Ukrainian, and I fully understand this influence from Russian Empire and then from the USSR. What I wanted to add is the role of this artificial creation of only Russians in culture. I will explain what I mean. For example, Ukrainian language during the Russian Empire was prohibited by 2 laws that were passed by Tsar's regime. And this is a very interesting thing because, for example, Ukraine might have had a really nice artist, famous worldwide, but they just didn't because it was prohibited. And those who violated the law, who spoke Russian, who didn't speak Russian but spoke Ukrainian, wanted to create the literature in Ukrainian language, which back then was referred to as small Russian language, малорусский язык in Russian. They were either executed or sent to Siberia or something like that. Therefore, Ukraine could have had more worldwide renowned people now, but they didn't. The same actually during this USSR period. The language actually plays here a very major role. For example, teachers who were Russian speaking, they earned more than those who were Ukrainian speaking. So what I'm saying is that a huge part here plays also this influence on the colonies, because colonies didn't have any opportunity to have anyone who spoke in their language or who wanted to develop their culture. Yeah, this is what I wanted to add.
Thanks for making that point, and I think it's so important to just reflect on the history of the Stalin era purges in Ukraine and the systematic attempts to eliminate the sort of Ukraine's cultural capital. Let's have more questions. I don't think we need to respond to that. Prime Minister Kubilius.
Sorry, Edward and Christina, as you asked, not very polite questions. I will try to do my job. And maybe the question is more for Edward, I don't know. You know such a writer, Joseph Rudyard Kipling, British one, as I understand, quite famous. And we were reading some pieces of him. And I just, did my homework here. I, put on Google, search very simple thing, Kipling and British imperialism. And what I see, what an answer I got. I am quoting from one article. I don't know who wrote, but from one article. As Britain entered a high expansionist phase at the end of the 19th century, Kipling became the great imperial poet and propagandist. Second quote. Kipling's ideas were backed by political, racial, moral, and religious beliefs which held the British as culture of superiority with a moral responsibility to the uncivilized world. It sounds, for me, a little bit similar to what, we were talking here about Russian imperial, culture. Yeah, so, sorry for, you see, my provocation is working. Rasa is immediately reacting. But my point is very simple. Countries were going through some phases of, their development. There were empires, there were, other developments. And, sometimes we're trying to evaluate the country's culture or, writers looking from our today's, position towards what they were saying during that different period. And I think that in all, I don't know, we can ask, our French friends, to speak about, their writers of that French imperial period. Perhaps everywhere we shall find something of that. I'm not saying that, I would like to whitewash, Russian culture. But I think what I would, look into, really how to normalize our approach towards Russian culture. Where was everything? Pushkin was speaking about empire, Kipling was speaking also about empire. Here were some other, great names, Mussorgsky or Rachmaninov. But that is, it does not mean that we need to, call Russian culture as a great one, as during Soviet time, Soviets were trying always to say. But also maybe we should be, in some way more objective to the whole discussion about Russian culture. So that's my point.
Well, I think that's what we're asking for, is objectivity. If the British government was going around the world donating busts of Kipling and saying that every British council office should have a picture of Kipling, I think that would be outrageous. Yeah. I would also, I don't want to get into a long argument about Kipling, but I think Kipling had a extraordinary sympathy for the people he was writing about, which was, he's not, by far not the most imperialist writer of that era, and in some quarters was seen as being rather subversive. He mocked the British sort of rulers of India quite often, berated them for not understanding India, had strong Indian characters in his novels, and was very gloomy about Britain's future. One of his best-known poems was warning Britain that the age of empire was already over, and with some suspicion this might be quite a good thing. But I think really the point is not to condemn, say, oh gosh, isn't Pushkin bad? It's to say, given what Pushkin was writing about Mickiewicz, or given what Brodsky was writing about Ukraine, that may help us understand the way Putin is behaving now, and it would be a sign of good health, of good cultural health in Russia, if Russians start looking at these cultural greats in not just 2 dimensions, but perhaps 3 dimensions.
Now, I would like only briefly to comment, also reacting to what the Ukrainian lady told before, because she touched a very important moment of cultural appropriation. Also, as what the Russian Empire was doing on one hand, it was subduing the national languages, prohibiting, we in Lithuania had the prohibition of the press in the Latin alphabet from 1863 to 1905. We were not allowed to print books in Latin, and we had to preserve our language. But at the same time, what Russia was very good at, and that's a difference from Kipling and from British Empire. The Russia was very good at absorbing the colonized and occupied cultures and saying that, this is us. We brought it. Russia has absorbed Ukrainian authors, writers, and artists. Russia has absorbed Tatar talents. We are not, somehow all the greatest Tatar artists, performers, they were always presented as Russian or as Soviet. And another thing, which is also quite different, colonizing, for example, after the partition of 1795, the partition of Commonwealth of both people, Russia has absorbed Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was by all objective parameters was a higher culture, country of a higher culture. And they dared to say that, look, Catherine II brought to you Lithuanians the culture and civilization. So I always ask people to elaborate how the culture and civilization could be brought to a country that had the university hundreds of years earlier than Russia.
I just want to recognise my friend Рафаеля Ґлюксмана, Member of Parliament. Thank you so much for your help in making this happen. It's great to see you here.
Anna Fotika is asking for...
Okay, so first Anna.
Well, actually, I would really love to give the floor to Рафаеля Ґлюксмана first, but that is okay. I have one remark. Why do we speak about Pushkin and about colonization? Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lucas, for mentioning this, because currently, nowadays, we have a really extremely brutal case of colonization going on, crimes against humanity, and simply we try to see and to assess why all of these things happen. Yes, certainly it was Rudyard Kipling, but in the same time it was Joseph Conrad, almost same time, with totally different approach to eventually same territories and totally different perception and history. It's difficult to think about similar process going on in Russia, and when we speak about Adam Mickiewicz, of course, it is in all manifestations of this art. I'm actually from early childhood. I used to read and love Russian literature. It was with growing up that I learned more and more of history, of my own history, and seeing intricacies and details in these beautiful pieces of art, in Lev Tolstoy, in Dostoevsky, in Lermontov, in Turgenev, everywhere. And that is why we ask these questions, because we try to understand what is simply not to understand, how these days such crimes are possible and just at our doorsteps. And by the way, I really love Christina sitting behind Edvard Lukasa. I received her book from Raza just today, and I can't help starting reading it, and I really loved this beautiful epic phrase of your literature, your texts. Congratulations, by the way. So that's my...
Rafa.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Christina, and thank you, Prime Minister Kubilius, for being so provocative and leftist as always. And that's why we get along, because I was going to ask the same question, knowing very well French literature. My favorite poet, Baudelaire, wrote horrific things about Jews, and some of my favorite French writers had words about colonization that are really disgusting. But every imperial society, which the Brits and the French were, developed also antidotes to their own imperialism. And that's the antidotes that are missing in Russian debate. And why we thought it was interesting, first to have you here, but also to question the cultural dimension of Russian imperialism. It's because after 20 years of illusion and blindness in Westminster in Europe saying that Putin was a partner, there is another form of illusion that's coming now, which is it's Putin's war. And that there is a one-man show in Russia. It's totally untrue. It's as if you would have said that German Nazism was one madman show. It's never a one-man show. And if you want to understand what's going on now, you have to understand what happened in the past and what led to it. And one thing that led to it is the fact that you didn't have, after decades of communist crimes and hundreds of years of imperialist crimes from the Russian Empire, you never had a deep soul searching, and a deep dismantling of the imperialistic mentality. And that's why this time we should be careful that even if Russia loses the war, which we all hope it will, and we should do much more to achieve that goal, that there is this time a trial of these crimes, and a trial that is not only a judiciary issue, but also a philosophical one and a cultural one. What could lead to these imperialistic crimes? That's the question that we should ask ourselves, and most of all the Russians should ask themselves, and should be asked. And this is why it's so important to understand also that it's a legacy and it's a community of responsibility, because Putin is not behind every single man who rapes a Ukrainian woman. Putin is not behind the guy in the bus who beats up a woman, or behind the teacher who calls the police to arrest a young schoolgirl because she drew a Ukrainian flag. Putin is not behind, or FSB or cops are not behind people who put pig's head on the door of my friends because they work for Memorial. That's the neighbors. And they did that by themselves. Of course, led by propaganda, but nobody obliged them to do that. And we have so many examples of spontaneous support for war crimes. And then we have to interrogate this facility to support war crimes and the spontaneous nature of reaction. For instance, when you see a Ukrainian hero being shot by a soldier, and then you see the commentaries on social networks, Russian social networks, and they are not written by KGB officers. They're written by people. And so what led to that, and what leads to this? Same way that German leadership was not behind every criminal killing Jews or massacring civilians. It's something that's deeper than just a police state or a one-man show. And that's why it's also very important to question culture. And to question culture doesn't mean at all to cancel culture, because one thing I want to make very clear is that if you cancel culture in Russia, you should also do it in France and UK. On that, I agree with my leftist friends there, Mr. Kubilius. and that's really not the point. But it's the idea is to go beyond the usual things that we keep saying, that we hate Putin. Yes, of course, and we should have done it since 1999. Yes, but in Western Europe, you have this illusion that is also making impossible the reunification of Europe, the true reunification of Europe. We have lost 20 years, culturally speaking, and morally speaking, and mentally speaking. We have lost 20 years because we did not recognize the fact that half of Europe was colonized by Russia, and that we should unite our memories. So that's the moment to do it now. Yes, I mean, if we don't do it now, then I don't know. We will never do it, and we will never be a united continent. So that's why it's so important. And since Raza is inviting power with me, I want to mention just one anecdote that you told me, and that makes very clear what was the mindset of Western Europe since reunification of Europe. It's when French really boldly, and we can be proud of that, decided to sell the Mistral to Russia after the invasion of Georgia. Lithuania had a bright Minister of Defense who came to see her counterpart and told her counterpart, the not so bright Mr. Morin, that the Mistral could be used to actually attack Ukraine or even Lithuania. What did he respond to you?
My arguments were two. One, that Russia is increasing. It was 2010. Russia is increasing very much military participation, I mean militarization of the region, Western region around us. And second one, that we are weaponizing country which maybe possibly can attack also NATO countries, and not only. The answer was like, as such, Madam, Soviet Union is gone, and you, Madam, have phantom pains. You know what does it mean, phantom pains? It's medical. When you have no hand and still feel that you have it and feel pain.
And how this arrogance was possible? Because we never reunited our memories. And we never, in Western Europe, have been open to alarms and alerts and history of Central and Eastern European countries. So that's the moment to do it, and for that we have to understand that when we speak about Russian colonization, the first thing to do is to listen to people who were colonized by Russia and the way they perceive it, and who still are colonized by Russia.
If I could just correct you a little bit, Raphael, I think that it's not true to say 20 years, I think it's 30.
Yeah, so, wow.
I think we actually had I was mentioning this at the beginning, we actually had the first warnings coming out in 92, 93.
Yeah.
And at that stage, it would have been far, far easier. And if we'd acted then, we would have hundreds of thousands of people would still be alive.
Yeah, actually, you had the first colonial war of post-Soviet Russia was 94 in Chechnya. Yeah. Or even before in Moldova.
So we've got a little... Now, there's a hand, been very patient hand there, a man with a beard. You have a very strong arm, so you've kept your hand up for some time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. My name is Peter. I'm from Slovakia, a country that's going to commemorate the sad anniversary of 55 years of Soviet occupation during the Prague Spring of '68 this year in summer. And an old Ukrainian friend once told me that there's a saying in Ukraine that Ukraine loves Europe, Europe loves Russia, but we often forget that Russia hates us both. And my question to you, and forgive me for being forward, as a Western European, Mr. Lucas, in light of recent events and in light of the war in Ukraine, and especially the hesitance of Western European countries like France or Germany in their support of Ukraine and in their denunciation of the authoritarian regime in Russia, do you think Western Europe is ever going to learn its lesson when it comes to dealing with Russia as a culture, Russia as a country, and the autocratic tendencies inherent to its culture that we've discussed today, especially given how Mr. Putin, but as our French colleague suggested, even the rest of Russia frames this war as a war against the West as such, in a spirit not all too different to Pushkin's. Thank you.
Well, I think it's when someone says he's fighting an existential war against you, it's even West Europeans may notice eventually. I'm slightly sceptical of this metaphor of the wake-up call. I don't think it's like flicking a light switch on and off. And even in the 1930s, there was we look back on these sort of huge sort of shifts in our understanding, and we think that it was all one way, but actually it wasn't. And if you look at the debate in Britain and America, even after 1939 in the attack on Poland, there were people still saying, hang on, wait a moment, isn't the Soviet Union a bigger threat? Can't we get it? There was appetite for a peace deal, which Churchill squashed. So I think the metaphor of a wake-up is not quite right, but I think that the shift is huge. And if you, I remember what we saw in I think it was 2008, the Prague Declaration, which said, put for the first time Soviet and Nazi tyranny on the same page. Just trying to get that talked about in the 90s was really, really difficult. I had people get up and literally walk out of the room because I dared to say that Hitler and Stalin were two sides of the same coin. So I think we've already had a huge shift, and there's a lot more to do. What annoys me so much is that we take this leisurely kind of master's course in geopolitics and history, and the price for this course is paid in blood and tears by other people. And the lack of urgency in the West is as shameful as it's shocking.
I will be the skeptical French on that. I'm not sure. And nobody here can be totally sure. If we had changed fully, we have changed. But if we had changed fully, then we will not be putting Zelensky in the situation of a supplier or a demanding person. Yes, he has to basically beg for things that we should give to Ukrainian resistance without being even asked for. And the way it's done now shows that I agree with you, I'm skeptical about the wake-up call thing, but we are half sleeping, half awake, in between. And there is a quote from Zelensky to the British Parliament the first time he addressed, when he quoted Hamlet, and he said that, well, after 15 days, I can respond to you that we responded to the Shakespearean question that we decided to be. I think that in some Western capitals of Europe, the question is still floating, So it's up to us now. It's a political fight. It won't happen like that. But if we had really decided and understood, then I think that the weapon delivery and the sanction will not look the same.
Do we have, I think, time for one more question? There was a lady there. Yes, go ahead with the black hair, please. Okay, let's take two or three questions and we come back. So first the lady there and then the lady in pink there. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm a trainee here in the parliament, one of the members, and I'm also from Ukraine. And my question is to our initial topic. And so you talked about this absorption of different cultural activists by Russia, and that we have to understand from history what is going on here. So the question is, how would you comment that actually this big piece of Russian culture is not that much absorbed from other countries, but rather stolen? So, for example, you read two quotes from about Russian soul. The first one is from Taras Bulba, from Gogol, and he's a character. From Gogol's book, he was a leader of Cossacks from Zaporizhia, which is a modern Ukraine right now. They were the very idea of the modern Ukraine. So there's this fun fact. A very long time ago, there was a Kievan Rus. Rus is the key word here. Modern and even old-time Russia has stolen the name and assigned all the history, all the achievements and values to themselves. So important to say that at that time, Moscow was still not existent yet, while Kiev was prospering. So there's a huge difference between Russian as Ruski and Russian as Российский. So Taras Bulba was not talking about Rus soul. He was talking about Rus soul as from like Kievan Rus, not Russian. And the idea of Russian big soul is not even there. It's stolen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the lady in pink.
Good evening. I'm also Ukrainian, and thank you very much for bringing this deep topic today. And given all the information that you gave us tonight, I have a question about further actions. Given all of that, further actions we know, for example, that in Belgium, in Royal Theatre in Le Mans, the season of Russian culture started in October, and it didn't end, as far as I know. Until now, they bring the culture during the war. And at the same time, we know that people who are participating in Russian culture, the actors and singers, opera singers, they are gathering money for war, and you can find it on the website of Bolshoi's theater, for example. So how can we deal with it on the European level, on the level of member states, and also on the level of civil society? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I just wonder if there's anyone in the room who's actually a Russian from Russia who wants to say anything. Yes, at the very back. Go ahead. I just said if there is a Russian from Russia who wants to say anything, I'd be happy. Well, do you want to make either ask a question or make a point?
No, it's pretty overwhelming. It's very far from my thought, or I have to think about it because I have never thought about that way. It's a different perspective. I have to consider it because, for example, you have. I see this event as a piece of political incrementalism because, for example, you haven't invited any Russian who could also prepare his version, and it's very biased. So that I can say immediately. So if you would like me to talk, I have to prepare myself, and I have also to think about all the points, and I can answer. But I think that this event is not just; it's very biased, and I think there is it's very little use of it in terms of humanity, because we are one humanity. It doesn't make sense to search for well, I mean that we always can have negative point of view, but still I think there are many Russians. The Russian civil society, it was forgotten. There is Navalny case, here is Sakharov Prize, there is a Sakharov Prize. So I think we have to consider these people as well. We can't just drop them aside. That's what I would like to tell you.
Thanks for that. I have no response to those questions, but Christina does. So
I have.
Finish us up.
The quote from Astolf de Cousteau about Russians: any disapproval they treat as treachery, any unwelcome truth as a lie. I think that the way for Russia sorting itself out and healing itself out, it's a bit of self-criticism and also paying the attention to what the neighbors of Russia think about her, to what other countries think about her. And responding to your comment, I grew up in the Soviet Union under the censorship. So I would never, ever encourage to cancel Russian culture or to censor it. On the contrary, I think that we must read the works of Russian classics. We must read Turgenev's Mumu to understand this, defeatism, this inevitability of the violence, of powerlessness, of hopelessness. We need to understand Russian culture in the light of the current events. As to the promotion of Russian culture, now about cultural seasons, art shows, and so on, we must remember one thing, that in this way we are enabling and encouraging the Russian state and the Russian government, because they're all Russian government institutions. I know from my colleagues in Russia who are players in the field of culture that all decent people who were not loyal to the government, who opposed, who disagreed with the war, they've been kicked out. So by playing the music by the Russian state orchestra on the radio, we are enabling the Russian state. We are paying the royalties, same with culture seasons in theaters. I would suggest to quarantine it for the time being until Russia sorts itself out and starts to behave in a civilized way as to earn the respect of other countries.
So, dear colleagues, unfortunately, we are out of time, but for me, it was a very good idea from Russian lady to have sort of second round of the discussion, and also to have people on the podium speaking Russian, also people, and I already have in mind some of them. I heard their debates on culture, on Svoboda, elsewhere, so it's really very, very interesting idea to have second round of the discussion. And at the end of that discussion, just few moments. First, what I learned a lot, thank you very much, from that discussion, but the most interesting thing for me was that we have leftist Kubilius and we have Рафаеля Ґлюксмана, so who is from SD political group, socialist political group in European Parliament. So maybe you can change your positions.
No, I will not change, but I'm welcoming my friend.
Yes.
And me as a liberal.
Okay, and you as a liberal.
Welcome too,
So,
Рафаэль.
just a short answer to my colleague, dear colleague Andrius Kubilius. Why it's different? It's okay to speak now about Pushkin and others from the same period of Great Britain was at that time also empire, because Great Britain politicians, the government, they are not using, and society, they are not using their imperialistic part, and those who were imperialistic wrote these imperialistic books as a tool against other nations of today. But Putin is using all those imperialistic Russian philosophers from the past as tool today. And about the right to speak or not to speak here on this podium without Russians, I think we have right and obligation to speak on Russian culture because we went through Sovietization, Russification. We were left without our Lithuanian language, Lithuanian books in 19th century. Colonization, because, of course, Russian culture was used as an instrument, and like supremacy above other nations they colonized. So we had to have feeling that we are very small and we are nothing compared with the Russian culture. Yes, we have terrible stories also, our own, Lithuanian. About those, I can tell you a lot next time, those who are not Lithuanians, about poets, they betrayed our partisans, our freedom fighters, and so on and so on. But every nation have different kind of events. But
it's one of the most important tasks I mentioned in the very beginning for Russia itself is to abandon its imperialistic past and never come back to it. So I think after you, lady from Russia, mentioned this, it's really very important to speak with those who think, who want different Russia. Because many of them, of course, for many of them, it will be the same as for you, something very new to hear about that. But without understanding others, it will be no new Russia. And without understanding their past of Russia, it will be no new Russia. It's my conclusion for that. But the most important conclusion is that I am inviting you for a glass of wine. So that will happen very close. I just will find my assistants. They are saying that after the event, we will continue informal discussion with some drinks at 3Q at the the third floor. Yes, we ended to third floor. It will be reception area, one floor up, and our team will help with guidance. Dear friends, thank you so much.